I'm Ryan O'Doud, and you're listening to Ryan's Audiobooks on the Issues Magazine YouTube channel. Today we're continuing with the Psychic Bible, the apocryphal scriptures of Genesis P-Orridge, and the third mind of the Temple of Psychic Youth, Section 1:16, Part 2 of Part 10, Time Mirrors. Magic Squares and Future Beats, the Magical Process and Methods of William S. Burroughs and Brian Gysin. Being the first part, change the way to perceive and change all memory. Our very first memories are hand-me-downs from other people. Various events and moments, amusing anecdotes of where we were babies and very small children. Usually stories from a period in our life that we actually cannot recall for ourselves. These are the cornerstones which we begin to add on to, building more conscious, personal, recorded, experiential memories. Usually without much consideration of veracity or motive, we assume those original stories whose source is usually parental are true, rather than separately authored and constructed mythologies. Yet with the best will in the world, they are edited highlights and lowlights from another person's perspective, interpreted by them, and even given significance and meaning by their being chosen to represent the whole of us before our own separate self-consciousness sets in. All the information we have at our immediate disposal as self-consciousness develops is from someone else. Everything about us is true. Everything about us is false. Everything about us is both. It is by omission that we are described exactly, creating an unfolding program not of our own choosing. We are edited bloodlines seeking an identity with only partial data and unknown motivation and expectation. I should point out here that Brian Gysin claimed very convincingly to recall being in his mother's womb, the traumatic drama of actually being born, and the horror of arriving at the wrong address in all subsequent events. I personally believed him. I also suspect it is a part of what made him so incredibly remarkable, important, and effective as a cultural engineer and innovator, as a sorcerer of light and language, and as a magician. These inherited brief moments are a little jigsaw puzzle, a picture that contains impressions of what kind of child we were in the eyes of our familial others. Without malicious intent necessarily, they still tend to guide us toward an unbalanced, prejudiced perception of who we are. They can easily become at least a basic sketch of our character by our parents, a blueprint made more solid by each retelling, less possible to challenge. Just as we tend to like to please our parents by doing what they praise, so we can also manifest and reinforce their criticisms as well. At their unintended worst, these assumptions and maps become the metaphors, enhancers, deciders, directives for a lifetime's neurotic self-image, selected recordings of who we are imagined to be, who we are instructed we are, who we are expected to become, what kind of adult we will unfold into, and of course, evidence of an inherited fiction from which we will be conditioned as to how we too will perceive the world and our place in and on it. Looping around and around, a self-perpetuating, self-fulfilling, and prophetic sampling into which we immerse ourselves without any great wisdom to hint. We might wait and see, listen and watch, question, and perhaps even re-edit in order to maximize our potential to become. If our self-image is primarily built upon the faulty, biased, prejudiced, and highly edited memory recordings of other people, with their own agenda of who we are intended to become as defined by this perceptual process of unnatural selection, then ways and tools that allow us to seize the means of perception become vital in our fight to construct a self, a chapter, an identity that is truly independently our own. Any magic that empowers us to do that, both sacred and profane, is a matter of survival, a cause of infinite concern in terms of the evolution of both our species and ourselves. In short, it's a divine territory that recognizes behavior, perception, and character as malleable matter, equal to all other forms of matter, distinguished so far only by our apparent awareness that we exist and have choices, mortality, and doubt as signifiers of our individuality. If there is any right, any birthright, it might well be the right to create oneself. Being the second part. In a pre-recorded universe, who made the first recordings? In a very real sense, I do not own my early life. The first memories I have are actually short anecdotes describing things that happened involving me that I actually have no recollection of. Interestingly, they all revolve around me doing something naughty which influenced others negatively by parental standards and for which I got blamed. The mistakes of others were placed very squarely at my door, a classic bad influence. For much of my life, these shameful crises were simply accepted on trust. I've never even recounted them myself for years without doubting their veracity, even as I have come to know how subjective, selective, personally convenient, and self-serving various sources of versions of events can be. We consciously and unconsciously edit out all kinds of things to suit ourselves, pragmatically or manipulatively, in order to make things happen. These are the roots of a childhood theater, of behavioral depth magic, a form that sadly suffers from being born out of devout ignorance and a total lack of shamanic guidance. Magic is, by one definition, if you will, the science of making things happen according to your desires in order to maximize control over one's life and immediate environment to create a universe that is perfecting in its kindness toward you. This could all be innocuous, and perhaps for many it is. For me, it has emerged as a key factor, a continuous exploration and a necessity for my emotional survival as a creative being, to free myself from imposed ways of being initiated by these uninvited guests in the recording device that is my experiential existence. My recordings are what I build my soul from. The act of independently visualized and consciously chosen creation builds that phenomenon. That is what I call and perceive as me. If I am not who I was told I was, then who am I? More importantly, can I find ways to change the original recordings, an inherited construct, and actually remember and become whoever it is that I am, or even better, who I dream I wish to be? Can we build ourselves? Are there methods, examples, tricks and techniques, methods and madness, analysis and delirium that empower myself? It's very easy to fall victim to peer group pressure, parental expectation, emotionally crippling tales that put the blame for negative events upon your personality and behavior. We are pushed, shoved, squashed, and bullied into submission and contrition. At some point in each being's life, I believe, we are presented with a critical choice, a classic cliche fork in our road of life. As this occurs, I would suggest that the split is between the non-census reality, consensus perceptual memory, pre-recordings of a more or less controlled and predictable biological timeline existence, and or opportunity to redefine self-perception and remix re-recordings, infinitely and chaotically, entirely unique, and original combinations and collisions of self-determined and self-created recordings assembled form, with and by freedom of choice. Instead of our identity, in all possible and impossible senses of the word, being built by others, we can build our own, and our own it. It was in 1967 that this critical concern overwhelmed me. Was there a system, a way to adjust, control, break up, and reassemble behavior, personality, creativity, and perception, so that novelty and surprise, the unexpected and improvisation could be applied to my identity, using myself as raw material, as malleable physically and mentally as any other medium? Could I change the way I perceive and change all memory? It seemed to me that there had to be a way to truly live my life as art and make my art an inseparable extension of my life. I began my search for a creatively centered system of applied magic. You might think that seeking out two beatniks was a funny place to start looking for a functional modern process of magic. In fact, it turned out to be exactly the right place to look, and just as I had hoped, it did change my life, and it did enable me to build with intention and clarity the bohemian, divinely seeking being I willed to become. If I was constructed on the foundation of and from inherited memories taken on trust, on metaphors handed down with their own agenda via language and image, what one might think of as the cultural DNA of personality, then I needed to confront the omnipotence of word control. It was imperative to my survival as a sentient being to locate the most advanced alchemists and the most radical in their field, in order to learn what I could of strategies that would force the hand of chance in favor of self-creation rather than submissive reaction. In Paris during the 1970s, Brian Gysin pointed out to me that it was extremely significant that the very chapter of the book of Genesis in the Bible is known as the creation. He also chose to point this out in an early permutation poem. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. I first met William S. Burroughs in London at Duke Street, St. James, in 1971, after a brief series of postal correspondence. I actually felt and seemed strange, as I had discovered his existence via Chuck Kerouac as the mysterious character Bull Lee. Confirmation of his being an actual person led me to the porn district of Soho in 1965, where I snagged a copy, first edition actually, with dust jacket by Brian Gysin of Naked Lunch. It had been prosecuted for obscenity, so porn shops were the only places in those days to buy Burroughs, Henry Miller, Jean Genet, and pretty much everything else I was consuming as confirmation, vindication, and affirmation as a 15-year-old. 6 years after beginning my beat odyssey via books, my very first question to him, living, breathing beatnik legend in the flesh, was, "Tell me about magic?" Being the third mind part. Nothing here now but the recordings. William had a cutout cardboard life-size photo of Mick Jagger standing by his bookcase. Its significance was the right of performance, not rock and roll. On the television set were a full bottle of Jack Daniels and Earl Moat, the first I ever saw. William was not in the least surprised by my question. "Care for a drink?" he asked. "Sure," I replied, nervous, and for one of the only times ever in my life, in awe. "Well, reality is not really all it's cracked up to be, you know," he continued. He took the remote and started to flip through the channels, cutting up program TV. I realized he was teaching me. At the same time, he began to hit stop and start on his Sony TC cassette recorder, mixing in random cut-ups to prior recordings. These were overlaid with our conversation, none acknowledging the other, an instant holography of information and environment. I was already being taught. What Bill explained to me then was pivotal to the unfoldment of my life in art. Everything is recorded. If it's recorded, then it can be edited. If it can be edited, then the order, sense, meaning, and direction are as arbitrary and personal as the agenda and or person editing. This is magic. For if we have the ability and or choice of how things unfold, regardless of the original order and or intention they are recorded in, then we have control over the eventual unfolding. If reality consists of a series of parallel recordings that usually go unchallenged, then reality only remains stable and predictable until it is challenged, and or the recordings are altered, or their order changed. These concepts led us to the realization of cut-ups as a magical process. At this point we broke open the hard liquor and each downed a large glass. Soon it seemed the bottle was empty. A cassette tape recorder as a magical weapon. When I was then told, changed the unfolding of my life in every possible dimension and concept of the word. He told me about how during the Chicago Democratic Convention in 1968, he had walked around recording the background noises of the Yippie demonstrations, the riots, the Mayor Daley repression and violence. As he walked, he would randomly hit record at intervals, cutting in the most recent sounds around him, creating a collage that was nonlinear time. What he observed happening was that as a configuration of trouble sounds occurred, i.e. police sirens, screams, chanting of slogans, the actual physical manifestation and or expressions of those sounds also increased in what we think of as the real physical world. His next experiment was to work with passive environmental audioscapes in order to check his evidence and see if it would be replicated. As William explained it to me later in what became an apocryphal action, he had decided to check more scientifically the theories he had been assembling with Brian Gysin regarding reality being a linear recording, a malleable medium or element that was subject as such to the intervention of edits and erasings, rub-outs and resculpting, if you will. Not far from Duke Street, where he was then living in voluntary exile, a choice I would find myself compelled to make years later, was a basic British Greek cafe called the Mocha Bar, where he might sometimes relax and get the classic English breakfast of chips, baked beans, fried eggs, fried tomatoes, mushrooms, and toast, with a large pot of tea or an instant coffee. Nothing special, nowhere special. The perfect place, in fact, to counter arrogance and snobbery, abruptness and poor manners on the part of the very people indentured to one's service. On one of those days, a day when all is overcolored, overlaid, and overbearing, William was treated with great disdain, with crass, crude, nastily aggressive, and insulting behavior quite beyond the pale of acceptable manners. Such was the rudeness and unpleasantness that William swore never to eat there again. But more than that, his disgust and anger was so intense and intentional, so unforgiving and angry in the moment that he felt quite compelled to experimental sorcery. His word to me, take no. What form did his curse take? Here follows my first lesson in contemporary intuitive and functional magic. William took his Sony TC cassette recorder and very methodically walked back and forth in front of the offending cafe at breakfast time and other times of the day, making a tape of the ongoing street noises that made the sonic background of its location. A field recording encapsulating a typical day via street signs. Next, he went back to his apartment, and at various random places on the same cassette he recorded trouble noises over bits of the previous recording. These were things like police car sirens, gunshots, bombs, screams, and other types of mayhem, culled primarily from the TV news. Then he went back to the cafe and again walked up and down the street outside, playing the cut-up cassette record complete with trouble noises. Apparently the tape does not need to be played very loud. In fact, just a volume that blends in so that passers-by on the other side of the street or a few feet away would not notice the additional sounds as implanted fictions. This process was repeated several times, quite innocuous to any observer. L'ombre invisible at work. Within a very short time, the cafe closed down. Not only did it close down, but the space remained empty for years, unable to be rented for love or money. We would do well to consider at this point that each individual human being is inevitably the center of their own universe, sensory, experiential world. Only you are physically present every single second of your personal life, and as a result, any person or event that takes place without your physical presence is a part of somebody else's unique universe. Of course, there are times when others are present, and then they will tend to assume you are all in one universe together. However, ask any cop if they got the same story from a variety of witnesses or the same description of a suspect, and you will be told in no uncertain terms that nobody sees or hears the same thing at the same time as someone else, nor do they share equal abilities to describe or recall what they imagine their memories have recorded. In other words, consensus reality is just that, an amalgamation of approximate recordings from flawed biomachines. The background of our daily lives is almost the equivalent of a flimsy movie set, unfolding and created by the sum total of what people allow to filter in through their senses. This illusory material world, built ad hoc, second to second, is uncommon to us all. It will only be seem to exist whilst our body is passing through it. After that, its continued existence is a matter of faith, and our experience of it, seeming to have a continuity of presence that seems solid, comes from our assumption only that we can apparently go back there at some future time of our choosing. It is quite possible that the energy or phenomenon that glues together a repeatable experience of solidity and materiality on this earth is the pressure of billions of human beings simultaneously and in close proximity believing in what they see and hear. Bear in mind that history is the collected recordings of subjective previous peoples and our species. What has survived, what has memorized or stored in some form, is usually assumed to be the store of our unfolding species. Nevertheless, we are more than aware that certain events are written up with agendas included. Bitter families, dogmatic religions, democracies, and totalitarian regimes all collude in this process of editing. It has crossed my mind that this entire planet is a recording device itself. As archaeology and anthropology and forensic science progress, we are able to discover and reveal endless details of happenings going back millions of years. Also, side by side, we have almost every period of human species history still continuing today. The Bushmen in Africa live in a basically prehistoric way. Tribes in New Guinea in the Stone Age, other peoples in barbaric Middle Ages, entire communities in Middle America live almost in a fundamentalist Victorian era, and yet others in places like Silicon Valley or Tokyo live in a technological science fiction future. This is a remarkable thing. Infinite micro-realities existing simultaneously, their very activation and appearance of reality, and infinite social macro-realities parallel and colliding and competing for supremacy, and with it the power to edit and describe a global reality. At this point, I still feel it helpful to remind the reader that this essay is necessarily, as part of an anthology, only an overview of the complex and wide-ranging evidence consistently to be found in the creative works in all media of William S. Burroughs and Brian Gysin. My thereby implicit proposal is that whilst Burroughs was indeed a classic literary figure of the 20th century, and Gysin a classic 20th century Renaissance artist, who together bequeath to us through intuitive science a method and a prophetic application of meaning, a pivotal approach to questions of perception in the nature and origin of literature and art that can only be fully appreciated and perhaps finally understood in terms of their central and passionate inner agendas and obsessions when reconsidered and reassessed as serious, conscious, and masterful, creative cultural alchemists and practicing magicians, a mission for which I have taken the linguistic liberty of coining the term occupation cultural engineer. As their works as this unexpected brotherhood unfold after their collaborations begin at the Beat Hotel in Paris during 1957 to 1963 and meticulously thereafter, one is immersed with them in a fascinating journey into pre-material consciousness, a place where direct and indulgent communications with the nervous system occur, where nothing is fixed or permanent. Everything is true and permitted, where ancient programming holds prisoner the possible truths of who and what we are, and where even words are potential enemy agents and distortion devices that assist in the suppression of our potential as beings. This wordless interzone was so inconceivable to even such a libertarian poet as Allen Ginsberg that he felt it threatened everything. It is not uncommon for people to demonstrate symptoms of fear and insecurity when the very fabric of their protective safety blanket reality is scattered, shattered, shredded, and then further cut up to reveal a central possibility of divinity and love within all things and perceptions of things. It can be painful to release the last connection to an inherited linear space-time reality, assembled from filtered essence of solidifying mundanity. In a magical universe, everything is malleable, changeable, interconnected at invisibly deep levels so subtle and subatomic that consciousness and intention can affect them. Intention is the work of envisaging and enacting will. Ray L. Hart, The Unfinished Man and His Imagination. In an oft-quoted moment, Jason proposed to Burroughs that writing is 50 years behind painting, by which he meant that painting had begun to call into question all the traditional boundaries and templates. Even reason and object were arbitrary and unnecessary markers. By his introduction of the cut-up in all its manifestations, Jason, the accomplished shaman, as Burroughs so rightly designated him, gave his compadre the magical tools required for a lifetime's astonishing body of creative work, recorded as literature, revelation. Their intricate and dazzling story and their functional demystified techniques and process continues to leak into present time in preparation for various possible futures. I believe that a rereading of their combined body of work from a magical perspective only confirms what they themselves accepted about themselves, that they were powerful modern magicians. To view them otherwise does a great disservice to us all. In this post-digital age, as we construct our own personal reality tunnels, it is my conviction that a positive unfolding of our species in an evolution that is non-destructive and anathema to polarization is absolutely central to our survival with ethical honor. In the ever more metaphysical world of physics, a parallel sequence of discoveries equivalent to their importance to science as the cut-ups system of magic as a culture has potentially reshaped our understanding of the universe and reality. According to physicist David Bohm, and simplifying as best as I can as a layperson, any apparent separation between matter and consciousness is an illusion, an artifact that occurs or is assembled only after both consciousness and matter have unfolded into the explicate world of objects in linear sequential time. As one might expect, the other realms would be the implicate world, which would be all those inner worlds, including thought, that take place outside linear time and sensory confluence. What is coming to be accepted as a non-material field of consciousness? Bohm's researches suggested to him that at the sub-quantum level in which the quantum potential operated, location ceased to exist. All points in space become equal to all other points in space, and it was meaningless to speak of anything being separate from anything else. Interestingly, a Cheyenne Apache shaman told me years and years ago that there was no word for death in his clan. They simply used the word separation to express the concept. Similarly, the Shiva holy man Pagalananda Nathagori Baba spent many patient hours deprogramming my Western linear mentality in order for me to better be able to grasp the concept of his path of no distinction. The Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus explained this absolute elsewhere idea hundreds of years ago when he was recorded as saying, The without is like the within of things, and the small of things is like the large. So now finally, after thousands of years, we have a consensus of great significance, born of this unprecedented and radical intersection between mystic, scientist, shaman, and artist. Partly for lack of adequate language, and partly to camouflage their subversive ideas in order to stay alive, various enlightened visionaries, often called heretics of the era, have employed brain-twisting metaphors to describe the universe of objective reality as an illusion. What scientists are trying to describe to us now is a universe where, according to thinkers like Niels Bohr and others, subatomic particles require an observer to come into existence, and without an observer's presence, they do not come into existence. Even more remarkable is that away from each of us observing from the center point of our individual existence, the universe is a measureless resonating domain of frequencies that are an open source that only gets transformed into this world as we think we recognize it after being accessed by our senses and entering our brain. There it is, decoded, encoded, acoded, in what knows which are all, as it is assembled according to the dimensions of linear time and space, and I would argue our subjective cultural expectations. There seems to be a growing agreement at the heart of creation, among those in service of the path of the divine, the scientific, and the artistic, that the primary reality is one of wholeness, an indivisible unity that functions not unlike a living being, or, my favorite analogy, a coral reef. So while we rush about, billions of us interacting experientially with our environment, various subjective events do, for all practical intents and purposes, happen to us in particular locations. On a subatomic level, things are quite different. On a subatomic level, Bohm proposes that all points in space become equal to all other points in space. They are non-localities. So to quote John Lennon, nothing is real, adding that, and it isn't there anyway. To sum up this section, the universe is a unified source, an infinite, open, timeless, intricate, quadversal frequency field in constant flux that appears to have objective form and material solidity when and because we observe it. And observe it we do. We observe it over and over. We are obsessed with recording it. Just think of all those hundreds of paparazzi documenting J-Lo's every move. And then we store it in monolithic museums, libraries, databanks. These huge repositories can act on a society's behalf to symbolize anthropological recorders in our maintenance of them. Our belief in their contents in turn functions as the batteries that charge up and energize the social hologram that we have assembled as nonsensus reality in order to give continuity, consistency, solidity, and even significant sense of meaning with enough consistency and reliability for us to function during life as biologically sentient beings. Nevertheless, it is our expectation that things will be the same, that a log will remain a log, and if enough of us keep creating logs as a matter of habit, eventually, yes, logjam, but it is still no more real despite the materiality reduced by repetition. It is not a coincidence that in more established doctrinal dogmatic religions worldwide, in so-called primitive tribal and or shamanistic cultures, in the rituals of public and secret Western magical and or Masonic orders, or in the ecstatic rhythms and ancient beats of trance-targeted music and the chants that go with such music, repetition of key power words and phrases are integral, as is the phenomenon of call and response. Even at this deepest level of a relationship with the measureless frequency field, with the universe as a unified open source that has no locality, we are trying to solidify and maintain our sensory illusions. The purpose of these various services is to collectively reconstruct a social reality seamlessly with language, with words and names, with devotional submission to the power of its story, and thereby, ironically, to put into strict bondage through this habitual repetition the essence of life itself. Why? In order to predict and control it. Often unwittingly, we empower the people who claim continuity of descent by colluding in these rites. The real hidden doctrine handed down through the ages, the central agenda is control. Why do those who seek control to maintain control for its own sake? How do they control? By controlling the story, by editing our collective memory, conscious and unconscious. In many ways, the edit is the invisible language of control and its corporate media allies. They cut and paste in order to separate us from each other by entrancing us with a pre-recorded reality that seamlessly isolates us in a world designed by those who would could immerse us in service to the fundamentalist consumerism, simultaneously divorcing us from the universe that is creation itself and an infinite pre-sensory source. Writing is not just an escape from reality, but an attempt to change reality, so the writer can escape the limits of reality. William S. Burroughs, Last Words. In Last Words, Burroughs writes of the enemy and their two weaknesses, being firstly that they have no sense of humor, and secondly that they totally lack understanding of magic. Later, he directs our attention to two other enemy weaknesses in reference to dogmatic scientific modes of inquiry, by pointing out that phenomena that only occur once will automatically be invalidated by virtue of their uniqueness, and that they have an insatiable appetite for data. We have seen that everything is indivisibly unified, that there were really no hard edges, no division between mental and physical worlds, or any worlds or dimensions, animate or inanimate. Instead, we have been introduced to a holographic universe of infinite interconnectedness that responds to the future beat of a shaman's drum. It is fundamental to understanding how to operate and interpret the challengingly effective modern and magical exercises of Burroughs and Gysin, with cut-ups as their foundation and words as the disputed territory. What we have been trained from birth to believe is a solid environment is only a tiny fragment of what is available to our perception. At the same time, the behavioral, political, and anthropological history of our society and culture has been written and recorded by authors fulfilling an agenda of and for vested interests who do not have our well-being at heart, leaving most of us trapped in their current descriptions of the universe. No two actual entities originate from an identical universe. The nexus lineage of actual entities in the universe correlates to a growth by assimilation that is termed the actual world, adapted with apology from Alfred North Whitehead, Process and Reality. Back to the cafe. Experiments have shown we live in a great deal of our lives asleep, filtering out sensory input. Filmistry as its residents are going to work in the morning. Add in a police car going past afterwards in the editing suite. Play it back to those same residents later that evening. Asked if this is a recording of the morning, almost all will say yes. They will also say that they recall the police car going by. This is the phenomenon Burroughs was working with. Added to the fragility of our individual neurological recording devices is the age-old technique of suggestion. Yet here we are faced with something perhaps even a little deeper. A conscious attack upon and alteration of nonsensus reality by a formalized ritual. In a pre-recorded universe, who made the first recordings? So ask Gysin and Burroughs. Further, if we all imagine as reality is equivalent to a recording, then we become empowered to edit, rearrange, recontextualize, and reproject by cutting up and reassembling our own reality and potentially the reality of others. If this is true and effective, then a magical act is taking place. Simplified, magic has been defined as a method for changing reality in conformity with one's own true will, or as a methodological demystified process that follows us to force the hand of chance in order to make things we truly desire happen based upon and within purity of intent. Crowley had said that magic has the method of science, the aim of religion. Brian Gysin talked of magic, saying it was the other method, an exercise for controlling matter and knowing space, and a form of psychic hygiene. So what happened to the cafe? If it were only suggestion, then it would have only discouraged the people in the street whilst William was walking about playing his tape. None of them might have been customers anyway. It was not necessary for the cafe proprietors to be aware of the curse. The premises closed and remained closed, followed by a series of brief failed businesses, long after William moved on to other activities. The process involves a reversal of our ordinary understanding that causes produce effects. The cause must precede its effect in present time, yet it must be presently existent in order to be active in producing its effect. Lewis Ford, The Lore of God. According to Gysin, in Here to Go, William sometimes used 2 cassette recorders, one in each hand, and occasionally even added his own voice, repeating an incantation he had written to intensify the focus of his spell. One particular incantation ended up part of the soundtrack of Witchcraft Through the Ages, aka Hexon, an obscure and really rather kitsch Scandinavian silent movie for which Burroughs did the voiceover, a quirky anomaly resulting from the fact that beat filmmaker Anthony Bouch had the UK distribution rights. Part of it went something like this. Lock them out and bar the door. Lock them out forevermore. Nook and cranny, window door. Steal them out forevermore. In addition to tape-recorded magic, William also enjoyed a version of the cut-up photograph as additional sorceric firepower. On one visit, as he explained magic to me, he very generously showed me some of his journals. On one page he had snuck in 2 pictures. One was a black and white photograph of the section of the street buildings where that same mocha cafe was that he'd cursed. Beneath it was a second shot of the same section of street, or so it seemed at first glance. However, upon closer examination, he had very neatly sliced out the cafe with a razor blade, gluing the 2 halves of the image back together, minus the offending establishment. This same principle can be applied to people one wishes to excise from one's life, and variations can be used according to your imagination and needs. Of course, these modern upgrades of magical practice can easily be integrated into older traditions if one desires. For example, one could put the cut-out image into a brown paper bag with one's invocation added in pencil, black pepper, broken glass, sharp blades, and vinegar, and then throw it over his shoulder into a graveyard whilst walking away without looking back. Once one accepts a possibility that the universe is holographic, and that at the smallest subatomic levels all elements of phenomena can be affected by all others, then the probability of these operations being affected become far more credible. Indeed, I would argue that a magical view of the universe is the most likely description we've proposed so far as a species. In The Job, Burroughs discusses silence as a desirable state. What he seems to imply is that words are potentially blocks, both by their linearity in our language system and the manner in which they narrow definitions of experiential events and actions. He says words can stand in the way of what I call non-body experience. He does not want to turn the human body into an environment that includes the universe. That would once more create limiting templates and maps of expectation that discourage new and/or radical explorations. Rationality and the fixed progression of physical biology narrow consciousness. One magical method he proposes is, what I want to do is to learn to see more of what's out there, to look outside, to achieve as far as possible a complete awareness of my surroundings. I'm becoming more proficient at it, partly through my work with scrapbooks and translating the connections between words and images. From the Third Mind interview with Conrad Knickerbocker, 1967. One prerequisite of most Western magical orders is that the applicant neophyte keep a daily magical diary in which they note their dreams, synchronicities, apparent resolution of temporal events, and desires after magical apparitions. This is not so much just to document and vindicate the system being applied, as to create an ongoing awareness of the constant relationship we all actually have, moment to moment, with the other. In a universe where everything is interconnected, interdimensional, and integrated, or as Michael Talbot describes it, holographic, the acceleration of impractical collaboration with this interrelation of energies and their ability to assist us in affecting manifestations is more clearly revealed by methodical documentation. It seems that the more one acknowledges this confluence of mutability, the more kindly its relationship to and with you is. This interaction is the one symbolized by the number 23 in Robert Anton Wilson's books, and in the mythologies flowing throughout his and Burroughs' fiction. It is not so much that the number 23 is a magical number that does tricks for the person who invokes it. It is more that the number 23 reminds us of the inherent plasticity of our inherited reality and our potential to immerse ourselves in that quality to our own advantage and possible well-being. It represents a magical vision of life rather than a linear and existential one. Significantly, Burroughs, like Kerouac and Gysin, kept dream diaries and journals, Gysin and Burroughs extending their range further by including cut-up texts, newspaper headlines, photographs, fictional routines, and poems in a kaleidoscopic visualization of multifaceted and layered reality. Burroughs suggests a practical exercise to amplify our appreciation of and practical familiarity with this manifestation. Try this. Carefully memorize the meaning of a passage, then read it. You'll find you can actually read it without the words making any sound whatever in the mind's ear. Extraordinary experiences, ones that will carry over into dreams. When you start thinking in images without words, you're well on the way. William S. Burroughs in The Third Mind. On August 6, 1981, I visited Burroughs in New York. He was living at 222 Bowery in the basement, a location fondly nicknamed and immortalized in various biographies as the Bunker. A book Burroughs introduced me to was Breakthrough by the Latvian paranormal investigator Konstantin Raudive. In his book, Raudive documents hundreds of recordings of the voices of the spirits of the dead. His method was unusual but simple. Attach a crystal receiver to an otherwise standard reel-to-reel in the socket where a microphone would be plugged, hit record, and see what appeared on tape. What Raudive found was that within a wall of white noise and hiss, various intelligible sentences and messages that he believed were from ghouls in the dimensions associated with being dead were audible. Given that we were meeting the Hiroshima Day, as Burroughs designated it, there was a feeling that perhaps quite a large number of dead souls might wish to break through. We set up an old tape recorder on the kitchen table where many a dinner soiree was held over his New York years and hit record. Each of us took turns listening through headphones, live to the noise and interfacing going down on analog tape as it slowly turned. After an hour, we played the results back, intently noting the slightest sonic detail. Like good objective laboratory researchers, we made notes, both on paper and recorded onto a cassette with the Sony Walkman I had with me. It was almost a parody of an autopsy on TV. Final report from the bunker? Nothing. Oh, how we hoped for evidence, but we got just the expected hiss and shortwave, Twilight Zone-type sounds, regardless. And Crowley was fastidious in reminding the initiate of this. We did not fall into the trap of lust of result. Sometimes only one phenomenon occurs to vindicate a theory. Sometimes things seem unrepeatable. In terms of this test, what is significant is that Burroughs truly believed in the possibility of communication with the soul after physical death, long before he went public with that in the last words. As a footnote in this experiment, an extra event is worthy of mention. During 1985, Psychic TV were recording a song about the deceased murdered founder of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones, called Godstar. Still fascinated by the Raudive book and Burroughs' dogged exploration of its technique as a magical tool, I arbitrarily, on impulse, told Ken Thomas, my co-producer and creative engineer, to leave track 23 of the 24-track analog tape empty. After all the elements of the song were recorded in the traditional multi-track way, I instructed him to rerun the master tape, with every track muted except track 23. This track was to be on record, but with absolutely no form of microphone, or even a crystal receiver plugged in. Simply a tape running through a deck with no scientific means of recording on one track. Ken seemed to think this was both illogical and a bit spooky, but to his credit, we went ahead and did as I asked anyway. When we played back the previous version, pristine and blank track 23, much to our amazement, we heard a metallic knocking at a few points. We replayed the track. It was definitely there and had certainly appeared during our token Raudive Burroughs experiment. Yet it seemed random and was not a voice. Suddenly I had a moment of clarity and suggested Ken replay the track with the vocals of the lyric and get some basic elements of the music added in the mix. The knocking sounds came very precisely under a sequence of words in the exact phrasing and position of the following. I wish I was with you now. I wish I could tell you somehow. Later I would change the lyric to, I wish I could save you somehow. If I'm truly frank, I took this as a sign of approval of the song and its message, which is that Brian Jones was murdered and received a callous treatment at the hands of the media during his last days. He became, for myself and many other fans of his iconography, a scapegoat in the essential, magical, and sacred way, sacrificed at the very least by ignorance and greed to the consumer and materialistic machine of linear reality. It is worth noting that at the time we were taping this song, the consensus opinion and official coroner's verdict was death by misadventure, with a lot of media hinting that he either drowned during an asthma attack, or he was so high on drugs that despite being an athletic swimmer, he drowned right in front of his current girlfriend and guests. Our magical message tended to imply that there was more to the story, and eventually, during the 1990s, a builder Jones had hired, Frank Thorogood, confessed on his deathbed to murdering Brian Jones by holding him underwater. Whatever you may choose to believe, it certainly appears to me that there are ways to make contact with realms considered other via the most simple of tape recording devices. Burroughs and Jason both told me something that resonated with me for the rest of my life, so far. They pointed out that alchemists always used the most modern equipment in mathematics, the most precise science of their day. Thus, in order to be an effective and practicing magician in contemporary times, one must utilize the most practical and cutting-edge technology and theories of the era. In our case, it meant cassette recording, dream machines, and Flickr Polaroid cameras, Xeroxes, E-Prime, and at the moment of writing this text, laptop psychedelics, videos, DVDs, and the World Wide Web. Please note that earlier we discussed the possibility that the universe is a holographic web constructed of infinite intersections of frequencies of truth. Basically, everything that is capable of recording and or representing reality is a magical tool just as much as it is a weapon of control. Being the fourth part. Look at that picture. Is it persisting? The first question Brian Jason asked me in Paris in 1980 was, "Do you know your real name?" I replied yes, assuming it was Genesis and not my given name Neil, and then inquired as casually as I could, "Tell me about magic?" Brian Jason was born in Taplow, England in 1918, but indicative of the unspecific density of his visitations on Earth, and I use the word visitation because until his dying day in 1986, Brian insisted that in being born human he was delivered here by mistake. His conviction of mislocation, and with it a disruption of a different, perhaps parallel dimensional existence, fueled this remarkably deep sense of irony and otherness, and was a central quality of his body of magical artistic work. Jason was a transmediator, a 20th century Renaissance man, a multimedia explorer and innovator. Innately disciplined, he would continually paint and draw, extending his calligraphic journeys into what Burroughs would describe as painting from the viewpoint of timeless space. During my conversations on magic with Burroughs during the 1970s, it became more and more clear to me that Jason was pivotal in his history of the magical unfolding and the techniques of cultural alchemy that had drawn me to this beat oeuvre, and from thenceforward I desired to make direct contact. During my conversations on magic with Jason, the cassette tape recorder that I had with me was tolerated only on the condition that certain key teachings were spoken whilst the tape was switched off. As he presented it quite plainly to me, magic is passed on by the touching of hands. In other words, certain ideas and methods are handed down master to student, one-on-one, directly in each other's physical presence. This agreement has been honored ever since and remains so. Nevertheless, just to have confirmation from him that it was indeed true that his work was contemporary magic, not simply artistic or literary experimentation, was a great solace and gave me determination in my personal path. It was Jason who first recognized the potential of cut-ups as a means to update and upgrade writing and art, and as a contemporary application of magic. In collaboration with Ian Somerville and Burroughs, he discovered and made cheaply accessible The Dream Machine, the first artwork to be looked at with eyes closed, the story of, and implications of which, were marvelously catalogued in John Geiger's book, The Chapel of Extreme Experience. In that book, for the first time, out of a kaleidoscopic cyclone, a blizzard of revolutionary scientific information and ultra-visionary creation, we are exposed to an incredibly significant creative and conceptual exploration of consciousness via Flickr. In terms of possibility, both Burroughs and Jason would often quote Hassan I. Sava, the old man of the mountains, who from his fortress in Alamut, Iran, was rumored to have controlled, using brutal assassins, a huge swath of ancient Arab civilization. His motto, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted," recurs over and over, especially in Burroughs' books. That is not so far from the Thalamic concept, "Do it, that will shall be the whole of the law," a theoretical connection that Burroughs appeared to acknowledge towards the end of his life. Jason spent 23 years living in Morocco. During that time, he ran a restaurant called 1001 Nights and would invite a group called the Master Musicians of Jajuka to play music for the guests as the entertainment. He told the story more than once of how that business crumbled after he found a magic spell, an amulet of sorts, rather elaborate one with seeds, pebbles, shards of broken mirror, 7 of each, and a little package in which there was a piece of writing, which appealed to the devils of fire to take Brian away from his house. Very shortly after this discovery, he lost the restaurant and ultimately returned to Paris. On one of my first visits to Paris to meet with Jason, I was blessed with a special evening. After looking into the Dream Machine for a couple of hours, Bashir Attar, then the son of the master musician of Jajuka, he is now the master musician himself after his father's death, and his brother cooked me a ceremonial meal. During the feast, Bashir played flute music that he told me raised the jinn, the little people, and the spirits who would bestow great fortune upon the listener. Despite the friction of the arrow when the restaurant was lost, a very powerful magical bond remained between the ancient system of magic and the most contemporary elaborations represented by Jason. Calligraphic magic squares were one of the techniques most commonly applied by Jason. He would reduce a name or an idea to a glyph, and then write across the paper from right to left. Turn the paper and do the same again, and so on, turning the paper around and around to create a multi-dimensional grid. Jason believed this scaffolding allowed the jinn to run with the intention of exercising control of matter and knowing space. These same techniques and consciously driven functional intention also permeated his paintings, and that, in fact, in a very real sense. Everything he created included an act of conscious sorcery, his paintings. William S. Burroughs described the central difference of Jason's painting as follows. All art is magical in origin, indeed to produce very definite results. Art is functional. It is intended to make things happen. Take porcelain stove, disconnect it, and put it in your living room. It may be a good-looking corpse, but it isn't functional anymore. Writing and painting were done in caves to ensure good hunting. The paintings of Brian Jason deals directly with the magical roots of art. His paintings are designed to produce in the viewer the timeless, ever-changing world of magic caught in the painter's brush. His paintings may be called space art. Time is seen spatially as a series of images or fragments of images past, present, and future. Jason felt trapped and oppressed by materiality, but optimistically searched for techniques to short-circuit control and expectation. He accepted nothing as fixed and permanent, reducing the most intimidating formulae of language to animated permutations that become portals of behavioral liberation. If, as we have seen, the universe consists of interlaced frequencies that pulse and resonate at various interconnected rhythms, then his search was for a future beat that would liberate the body and mind from all forms of linearity. Each magic square is essentially holographic, suffused with a directed unity. Intertwined in his grids as confirmation and illustration of the magical ideas proposed are examples of routines, exercises with words and densely cut-up texts. But we observe the complex, deeply serious mind and a cultural alchemist camouflaged by passionate humor. In Jason's words and writings, we are blessed with a perfect example of the storyteller-teacher, a practiced post-technological shamanic guide to the mind, providing exercises, navigational tools, and data to assist us in the essential process for magical survival and for the exploration of this strange place in which we unfold our physical existence, a domain we call Earth, society, and life, but rarely call into fundamental question. Rationality and materiality have generated a depth of inertia so profound that it could destroy our potential as a species to survive or evolve. All the more reason to reappraise and study as magical masters the instructive works of Burroughs and Jason as we traverse the 21st century. As science confirms the revelation of this space-time neurosphere as a holographic universe, I have no doubt that Burroughs and Jason, redefined as a cultural alchemists and practicing magicians, are destined for an accelerating appreciation for the seminal influence of their cultural engineering experiments. There's an exquisite mastery of perception that these discoveries unfold. Both Jason and Burroughs use a serial reduction of detail. Meaning is shattered and scattered to become more accurate and truthful representation of this arbitrary plane we needlessly confine by using the word prison reality. Consecutive events are subverted as we read, revealing the fragility and distortions that our conditioned senses filter out for simplicity of behavior and illusory reason. Nothing tends to remain as it seems, but becomes as it is seen. Contradictory experiences portrayed as equally perceived parallel images and thoughts. Mundanity is turned strange and disturbing. Burroughs and Jason, as master magicians, grasp the electricity of reality and our right to controlled scaffolding as we see and fit and prefer. They consolidate our right to active participation in the means of perception, and their proposal of the nature of consensus being is still quite revolutionary. As we navigate the warp and weft of biological existence and infinite states of consciousness, the holographic universe looks kindly upon us, and at the magic squares of their methods and the delirious madness they supply us with, we are offered a unique perspective and afforded respite, balance, in the possibility of retrieving new and valuable information for a future. We are not talking about a matter of faith here. Faith is something that is a low quotient in these experiments. Rather, we are looking at prophetic predictions based upon a magical vision of the universe and the resulting practical applications of alchemical theories and exercises. In fact, we are looking at an early workable model of the future, in which a positive, compassionate unfolding of our latent qualities as a species is defined and described in the vainglorious hope that we abandon all rational thought and immerse ourselves in the ecstatic series of creative possibilities. In a way, it's a bit like learning a martial art. We develop our media reflexes and accelerate our improvisational responses in order to maximize our individual potentialities in the interests of our chosen people of our private dream agenda. In his various essential commentaries on media divulgence, David Rushkoff astutely directs us to re-examination of the original source of an inherited narrative of culture and life. His conclusions are very similar to my assertions in relation to Burroughs and Gysin, that the very history that began this examination, the social narrative imposed upon us as a child, that so easily programs us to maintain every possible status quo without criticism, and that compounds the notion of linearity in a serial phenomenological universe, seems more clearly to be an illusion and deliberately inert construction. A picture of reality that is designed by those with a vested interest in stasis to maintain our surrender to cultural impotence in all forms of addictive consumption. The past controls through people in their surrender to a closed system, where the laws of physics remain constant and predictability is a desirable state in an ever more rigid global world order. Yet, in fact, we are entering a digital future, a holographic universe where, very theoretically, every sentient being on Earth will be interconnected, international, and interfaced. Entirely new navigational tools are required. The possibilities are endless. It is my contention that as the authorship of our own private narrative becomes increasingly autonomous, malleable, and optional, that a new future, a future that is inclusive, that is rooted in the idea of an open source that we can effect by logical and alchemical means, becomes critical to our species' survival, comprehension, and evolutionary change. A future where Burroughs and Gysin and their modern cultural brethren have supplied prophetic functional skills and non-local points of observation, which can train us to fittingly alert and prepared for the unpredictable aesthetic and social spasms to come. Endnotes. See even further the Metaphysics of the Sigil by Paul Cecil and Painful but Fabulous. 2. Another magician from a different school might call them egregors. Genesis P-Orridge, 2006. This concludes today's reading of the Psychic Bible, Section 116, from Part 10, Time Mirrors. Tomorrow we conclude with Section 117, Part 10, Time Mirrors.